Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a film critic and writer, and today I am delighted to be talking to Ian Christie, a renowned film scholar. He has been a regular contributor to Sight and Sound, and he has worked substantially on earlier Soviet cinema as well as the works of Michael Powell and Emeric Pressburger. He has written 2, maybe 3 directors on directors books for Faber, including Scorsese on Scorsese and Gilliam on Gilliam. He's one of those guests that I've really wanted to have on for a long time, so I'm really pleased to get him on. Thank you very much as well for the support while I was in Cannes. I hope you enjoyed the diaries and the special reports that I took out. Over the summer I will be attending several festivals, so I will be kind of copying that format throughout the summer so that you keep getting regular episodes. So this will be more writers on festivals for some of those episodes, but I will keep a steady diet of writers on film coming over the summer months, so I hope you enjoy that, and we have plenty of guests to look forward to in the coming weeks. If you enjoy this episode, please remember to like, subscribe, leave a review and spread the word on social media. Before you do that though, enjoy the conversation.
Where would you like to begin?
One of the things that fascinates me, as has inspired this podcast, is how people get to become writers about cinema, where their interests in cinema starts, and how that transforms into writing initially articles and then books about cinema.
Gosh, that involves maybe going back rather a long way. I guess I started writing about film because I was fascinated by film as a teenager, and I found myself the editor of a magazine at university. We were publishing a few, promising young poets like Seamus Heaney and people like that, who was coming up through in Belfast. But it gave me a chance, because I was the editor, to write about things that were happening in cinema. And I wrote 2 or 3 pieces as well as editing the magazine. And I guess I kind of slid into it really from that starting point. Of course, there weren't, when I moved on from being an undergraduate, editing magazines like that, there weren't the same opportunities. And I suppose what really got me started was writing about Russian cinema was very important. I started publishing stuff about what was very exciting developments in Soviet cinema at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. And that led to a number of books, and eventually it led to a sort of big tome called The Film Factory, which was a joint production between Richard Taylor and myself. But at the same time, this all really kicked off in 1978. 78 was a busy year for me because I was working on the Soviet stuff, and we produced a little pamphlet, really, of translations and essays about forgotten aspects of the great Soviet cinema of the 1920s. But at the same time, in exactly the same year, I don't know how I did this, I managed to produce a slim book on Powell and Pressburger. I think it was mainly my wife pointing out that I could do it faster if we got an electric typewriter. It was back in those days. So
Technology.
I did, and we moved a bit faster. That was after I'd taken a portable typewriter in my suitcase when we were off for a romantic weekend in Venice. And she said, "This can't go on. You've got to get..."
Those things made quite a racket.
Yes, they do, indeed. And so did electric typewriters back in those days, yes. So for me, those two things happened in 78, and they were both a kind of launch pad for what had been really two different strands of my activity ever since, plus a few other strands that have come in since. But the Powell Pressburger book, which was called Powell, Pressburger and Others, it's a little sort of 120, 150 page booklet, was done really because there was nothing about Powell and Pressburger in those days, absolutely nothing. And I researched it from scratch, going through the trade magazines, pulling together credits. I even went through the newspapers from 1960 with all the critics who had slagged off Peeping Tom. They really, had it in for Peeping Tom, and they outdid themselves in pouring scorn on it. The only satisfactory way to deal with this film would be to flush it down the loo. That was Derek Hill in Tribune.
Wow.
So I was the first person to pull together these wonderful quotes about just how much they hated it. And of course, when I see people referring back to this now, I realize they're using my piece, my anthology of quotes. That's okay. I was the first to do it. But I then discovered a bit later, a few years later, when I was in contact with Martin Scorsese, who was, emerging as an advocate for many kinds of cinema, not his own just. Martin told me that he'd got, I think, 4 or 5 copies of my little book, which he kept in the different places he was living at that time, just in case something came up on television. You had to have a way of looking it up. So he had this handy reference book, which was exactly what it was intended to be, in case something turned up on late night television. And that really was the only way that you could see obscure British films, by the likes of Powell and Pressburger.
It's funny how that has changed. The reputation has changed so fittingly, so appropriately, but also so massively. A film like Peeping Tom, which was derided upon its release, is now considered a knockdown classic.
It is very strange, and I've watched it happen, of course, and I've been to some extent involved in helping it to happen. And so, yeah, I feel quite close to that process. And I've been thinking about it recently. In fact, I'm thinking that there's definitely a new book to be written, although I've written a lot about Powell and Pressburger. But there's a new book which probably should be done to just reflect on the change in taste, because the films were hard to see, of course, back in the 70s. They were incredibly hard to see. And it was two things. I think it was video, which arrived, of course, in the course of the 80s, and television. I first saw the Powell Pressburger films on television, but you couldn't record them. You had to be in front of the television, when they were on. But I know that I saw some of the key films, probably A Matter of Life and Death, for sure, on television. Then video came along. I was involved in video publishing for the BFI at the end of the 80s. So we were able to put out these films on VHS. And that, again, helped enormously to spread the word. And it meant that people could discover the films for themselves. And I think that's absolutely crucial. I mean, video was a huge engine of discovery. And it really helped people come to terms with things and formulate their own ideas, which had not really been possible to the same extent before. And then I think something mysterious happened, and I've never quite managed to put my finger on this, but sometime near the end of the 80s, there's a kind of turnabout in taste, a real change of aesthetic perception. Things that people had thought were a bit naff, maybe 20 years earlier, suddenly looked wonderful, strange, magical. I mean, a very good example would be the Powell Pressburger film Tales of Hoffmann. When Tales of Hoffmann first appeared back in 1951, nobody knew what to make of it. They thought it was just the weirdest, oddest film. I remember Ray Durgnat, great writer, and one of the early people to take up Powell and Pressburger. Ray wrote about it. He said it was like a sort of ye olde junkie shop, meaning that they'd thrown everything into it. You know, there's an incredible sort of mixing of styles and materials and genres and so forth within the film. And he didn't mean it negatively entirely, but that was how the film looked to him. And he was pretty eclectic in his tastes. Nowadays, I think when we look at the film, especially with Scorsese's endorsement, you know, saying it was the film that he saw on television as a kid that really turned him on to understanding cinema. He said that frequently. We look at it through
and in Scorsese and Scorsese.
We look at it through different eyes, and really something has changed because some of us are the same people with the same eyes, but somehow the climate, the aesthetic climate has changed, and certainly younger people coming up now who I guess are growing up kind of taking for granted that the Powell Pressburger films are somehow foundational, that they're wonderful. I'm amazed when I discover that. When I ask young people, what do they think of them? They say, oh, they're just great, they're wonderful. And I think, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you couldn't give them away. What has changed?
I sometimes think of it. I don't remember the source of this. It's definitely not me, obviously, but I remember somebody talking about English literature and talking about there being two poles of English literature. There's the sort of King James Bible, austere, a limited vocabulary, clarity, not using too many adverbs or adjectives, and then there's Shakespeare, the massive vocabulary, repetition, filigreed, complicated, and one is a garden and the other is a meadow. One is controlled and the other one is wild. And I sometimes think the same can be applied to cinema, where you have people in British cinema, particularly like Nicholas Rowe, Ken Russell, and Powell and Pressburger, who represent this much more wild and much more magical, much more transgressive form of cinema. And it isn't the Merchant Ivories of the world, who by the way I love. That's not knocking Merchant Ivory, but they're not as producing sort of something which is more recognizably in a certain place. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does. It makes a lot of sense. That's a good way of putting it. I've not heard that distinction cast in that way, but it does make a lot of sense. And for instance, I know that the people who remained unconverted to the cause of Powell and Pressburger, people like Victor Perkins, very, very influential critic, and generations of kids have read his book Film as Film as part of their studies, film studies. Victor never saw anything in Powell and Pressburger. He remained utterly unconvinced. What were his favorite films? Max Ophuls, things like that. I mean, he revered Ophuls' work, which is very controlled, I guess. But in the case of Powell and Pressburger, in my writings about them and in my book Arrows of Desire, I cast them as belonging to a sort of Blakean tradition. It's very similar, I think, to the distinction you're making. Wild, craggy, over the top, in many ways, romantic, certainly, and all that goes with that. And I think that is the secret of their appeal. And I think what changed in the collective aesthetic taste was a much greater interest in that kind of work, and not just in cinema, but in music, in art, and so forth. I guess we only realized that Powell, for instance, could be seen as one of the neo-romantic artists that emerged in the 1940s, along with Dylan Thomas, many of the painters that he loved, Cecil Collins, John Craxton. There was a John Craxton exhibition recently, and I checked with Thelma Schoonmaker, and she said, yes, Michael was a devout admirer of John Craxton. In fact, he owned a number of his pictures. So we begin to see that they were in part of an aesthetic movement, but it was a movement that didn't really get a name and didn't really get credit until many decades later.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also that sense that, to me, my experience of watching Powell Pressburger and coming to it relatively late, via DVD, it has to be said, is that the films always surprised me. They always confounded my expectations. So I think the first one I would watch would be The Life and Times of Colonel Blimp. You know, I know the sort of idea of a stereotype of Colonel Blimp, so I'm waiting for that sort of film, and I don't get that. And then Matter of Life and Death, I'm expecting a certain film at the beginning, and it goes off in directions you couldn't possibly anticipate. And I wonder if that's something to do with the reception as well, that by defying generic expectations, people can be left dissatisfied. You know, oh, I was hoping it would be this, and it turns out to be that. Whereas 10 years along the line, you just watch them for what they are.
I think that's very true. And it's it's also connected with the fact that the films have really found their mass audience, the deep audience, if you like, in the era of repeatability. First of all, it was video, and then it's DVDs, Blu-rays, etc. And that has allowed people to really get to know the films and to discover their many layers. And when I started trying to unpack the layers of, a film like Blimp, I published a special edition of the screenplay of Blimp, in which I kind of dug into what we know about how they assembled the film. And I discovered there were like 3 layers to it. There was what they wrote, and then there was what they shot, and then there was what they put in the film. And they're different. Mm. So it's a film which is kind of packed and selected from all the wonderful material that they generated. And there's so many kind of allusions and references and things that go off in different directions, which you can chase up. And that's even more so with The Matter of Life and Death. I wrote a book about Matter of Life and Death, which is just got republished a few years ago. And I had great difficulty squeezing all the stuff I'd found into the confines of a little BFI Film Classics book. In fact, I think they asked me to shrink it a bit because there was too much in it. But it was really just stuff that I had come up with through diving into the film and just following some of its rabbit holes, if you like. Except I would say they're not rabbit holes. They're all related to the central themes, which Blakean.
I was wondering as well, you mentioned just then that you spoke with Thomas Schumacher about one of the influences of Michael Powell. Did you had opportunities to talk to Powell and to see how he was reacting to the reassessment of his career?
Oh yes, I did. I dragged him through that. I got both Michael and Emeric to agree when we did the big retrospective at the NFT in 78, which is what I did the book to accompany. I got them to agree to come and introduce a number of the films. And yes, I guess given the difference in age, I guess I got to know them as well as anyone because they were pleased. Having been out in the cold, forgotten, they were very pleased and kind of surprised to see their films from so long ago being reassessed. I remember, for instance, a film that they remembered as a failure, which is now revered in many quarters, A Canterbury Tale. That film had been literally unseeable right up until 78, when the BBC restored it to its original shape and length. But Michael and Emeric remembered it as a failure. For them, it was the first time that they'd met with a fairly negative critical response, after films like One of Our Aircraft is Missing and The 49th Parallel. And they felt that they hadn't explained what they were trying to do in the film properly. And I could not persuade them to actually come in and watch it again. I remember them standing outside saying, no, that was a failure. We didn't get it right. And of course, several generations since then have decided that they most definitely did get it right. But for them, of course, the memory of kind of critical rejection was still quite strong. But gradually over the years that I knew them, I guess I knew them, from the late 70s through until their deaths in the 80s. During that time, they kind of relaxed a bit and they began to appreciate and respond to the levels of interest. I remember we managed to raise the money to make a new restored version of The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, which was a really difficult and expensive job to do because there was no negative that we could work from. So we had to reassemble it in the right order. We finally did this in 85 and did the premiere, effectively, the modern premiere of the film. Huge, huge response. We did a premiere in a London cinema, the Screen on the Hill, and we had dozens of filmmakers present. I mean, Terry Gilliam, who lived nearby, was there, and everybody was falling over themselves to say how wonderful it was. I remember we asked Neil Jordan, who was just emerging as a young filmmaker, to do a piece for television, or a Channel 4 television series called Visions, about what he liked so much in Blimp. And I remember standing with Michael and Emeric watching this on a monitor. It was very interesting because Michael's response was, "Oh, I'd like to meet him. He's got an interesting angle on the film." And Emeric said, "Why does he want to do that?" Because he was kind of playing around with the film and, not just taking it straight. And of course, that tells you a lot about their very different temperaments and characters and so forth. But Emeric, I know, was enormously gratified and pleased as he came to the end of his life to know that what he had put into Blimp, which was his favorite amongst all their films, was being appreciated by much younger people. And that meant a huge amount to him. He wasn't the kind of person to express it fulsomely, but you could see that he was drawing strength and comfort from that.
It must be, it shows you two things. One is that people from that era of making films didn't necessarily know how their films would survive. The old idea that it's a different medium, but the BBC would tape over wonderful programs that were made for them just to save money and instead of buying new tape. And the other thing is that these artists that we revere as sort of very confident visionaries actually form their opinions of their own work via the feedback they get from the public. And if the public give them a negative feedback and critics give them a negative feedback, they're not quite as, they're not the Caspar Frederick David, wanderer above the clouds that we would like to have in our heads. They're more, they're more like us.
They are indeed, and I think it's very hard for a filmmaker to sort of overcome that sense of rejection. I mean, certainly back in the time when they were making their great films in the 40s and the 50s and even into the 60s, the idea that films would be around indefinitely was pretty unusual. They didn't know if or that their films had survived. Michael Powell wrote a book about the Battle of the River Plate. And he says in the preface to the book, which is, that became their film, as it were, but he wrote a book about the story of the Battle of the River Plate because he says books are a more durable medium than film. Right. And he meant it. He knew that if he published the book, it would hang around, but there was no guarantee whatsoever that the film would hang around. And indeed, that film, Battle of the River Plate, one of their last big film together, was shot in a process that no longer exists, VistaVision. So we can only imagine what it would have looked like, what it did look like in VistaVision. Staggering, absolutely fantastic. And whenever I see it on a smaller screen today, I keep reminding myself that the reason the shots are composed the way they are is because Michael was taking full advantage of that gigantic acreage of screen. You can see that he's thinking, just as he was in O Rosalinda, he was thinking about how to use CinemaScope, their first ever CinemaScope film. He was thinking how to use CinemaScope because he was very interested in the changing technology of cinema.
I want to ask Werner Herzog about his books and his cinema. I was basically declaring myself a fan of both, and he told me that his books would survive a lot longer than his films. Like hundreds of years from now, they would still be reading my books. Sorry, I didn't mean to do the voice, but it's automatic.
It's true, and it is literally true, of course, because although we like to think that films that have been saved and restored and republished in many formats are more secure, they're not. And, hearing just recently that a film that I remember well being premiered by a friend of mine, Murray Grigger, his film about Billy Connolly, Big Banana Feet, was lost, completely lost, until some keen-eyed archivist saw a 16mm copy available, being offered on eBay, bought it, and that became the basis of the restoration. talk about fragile. I mean, that's a very recent film. So no film can be considered secure. It's still, if you like, an insecure, evanescent medium. And we remember that. I mean, as you know, I've done a lot of work on early British cinema on Robert Paul, the founder of our film industry. And I reckon Robert Paul produced probably about 800 films in his career between 1895 and 1910. We only have about 80 of those. The rest will probably never appear. They were just discarded. And, I live in hopes that somebody will discover a great sort of barrel of them somewhere, like the Michelin Canyon discoveries, where they discovered hundreds of Michelin Canyons actually crammed into a barrel, quite literally, able to restore them. I keep waiting for the moment when a load of Robert Paul films will appear like that, but I don't think they will.
So we're basically looking through keyholes to some of these figures.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. And we have to make the most of what we've got, because there's a lot we don't have. I mean, even in the case of Powell, we don't have 5 or 6 or 7 of his films from the 1930s, and we've got a lot missing there, which would probably shed new light on the education of a filmmaker as he was working on that.
I think that's what is fascinating as well about your career as a film scholar is you've gone back to the very, very beginning, but you've also followed very contemporaneous figures like Scorsese, like Terry Gilliam, and you have this breadth of work that you've done. When you look at it, do you see this all connecting as you work on even a later book? You might be thinking, I see connections with the beginning here.
Yes, I of course I do see connections, because I'm me. So I'm the connecting thread. I've followed. I kind of followed my nose, and I think if there is any single thread that runs through, it's really trying to look at things that are kind of ignored and disrespected, unrespected, not even known about, and that seems to be what attracts me. When I started trying to assemble material on Powell and Pressburger, nobody wanted them, and I couldn't believe this. And to some extent, that was never the case with Scorsese, but there is a connection there, because when he was over in Britain promoting actually a film that he had been making while I got to know him in Chicago, that's The Color of Money. We were listening to him do an interview at the National Film Theatre. I was sitting next to Michael Powell, and Michael said, "That would make a wonderful book." And really, he heard immediately that Marty had this wonderful ability to explain what he was doing, talk about it very candidly, much more openly than many filmmakers would, and very, very engagingly. And so we literally started assembling the book that became Scorsese on Scorsese that evening. David Thompson's interview was recorded. I did 3 more interviews in the following week or two as we took Scorsese around the country. And that became the basis of the first edition of the book. And then I went and met with him, saw him subsequently, and we did 2 more editions of it, updating it as he became a kind of more prestigious filmmaker. But the great thing about Scorsese is he never lost his interest in his willingness to talk about films that didn't happen. I mean, that's very unusual amongst filmmakers. They will very often not tell you about the things that didn't come to pass. But Scorsese, certainly in the early years, was very happy to talk about his plans, his ambitions, which might not happen. And then unexpected things crashed into his career. Like he never thought he'd get to make Last Temptation of Christ. And I remember saying goodbye to him in Glasgow, and he thought he was going to be making something else. And suddenly, within a month, the opportunity had come up, the funding was in place, and he rushed off to Morocco to make it.
Wow.
But then again, much later, when he was making Hugo, which is his film about early cinema and about Georges Méliès. Of course, by that time, I'd done a lot of my work on Robert Paul, the pioneer of cinema in Britain. And it was Robert Paul who sold the equipment to Méliès that allowed Méliès to get started back in 1896. So I said to Marty, you will make sure that, you credit Robert Paul in your film. Yes, he said, yes, I will. Don't worry. Well, if you look at Hugo, you will not find any mention of Robert Paul. he was going to be visibly credited. And I saw in the props department, I saw they had a lot of props ready to actually show that indeed Méliès had got his equipment from Paul. But somehow, making that point when they got into the edit, it would have held the film up. And so one of the things I regret about Hugo, and I've said this to Marty on a number of occasions, is that it doesn't really quite take the opportunity to just correct the received history, because it could have done. It's a great film, and it really captures a sense of the excitement of early cinema. And a very important aspect of it is that it captures the way that the pioneers felt discarded, because the story of Méliès is the story of, someone who was forgotten and reduced to running a toy stall only 20 years after he'd been at the top of his game. So that's something that Marty certainly identified with very strongly, but he didn't quite take the opportunity to correct the history. And so Méliès remains very well known, and Robert Paul, well, I'm still trying to make people aware of just how important he was to getting the whole idea of cinema going.
There is something about the concertinaing of time as well when it comes to looking at these great figures that you, as you just said with Méliès, he's doing this massively foundational, important work helped by Robert Paul in terms of the equipment, and then only 20 years. It's like there are so many careers which take less than 5 or 10 years to really come to their peak and then decline completely. I mean, Orson Welles, I always think of as, there's not that much time between him making, Citizen Kane as his first film and making sort of his last sort of significant film that he can complete and have control over. It takes place again in the space of about 20 years. But I look at Orson Welles as almost being a country in himself. As if he spans the whole century, and of course he doesn't.
No, he doesn't. That's very true indeed. You're absolutely right. These sort of fire rocket. No, that's not the right word. It's like a rocket going up, trailing sparks, and then it comes down very quickly. And the people whose careers are like that. For different reasons, of course. When I was a student back in Belfast, I actually saw Orson Welles on stage. I have to pinch myself sometimes because he came to Belfast and did a tryout for what would become, his great film, whose title, of course, I'm going to forget immediately.
Othello or
Chimes at Midnight.
Right, oh, of course, yes.
He rehearsed it he performed it as a stage play with some of the actors who would appear in it at the Grand Opera House in Belfast. And of course, I have no very immediate memory of that, but I know I was there. I know I saw him. And
that's like seeing the Beatles for a cinephile.
Well, indeed, I saw them too. In '64, they came to Belfast. Nobody had a clue what they were performing because the amplification wasn't up to dealing with the level of audience noise. So we were all standing in the crowd saying, "What are they singing?" Nobody could tell. But it's short careers and careers that fizzle out. I mean, the other person that I've spent a lot of time on, I guess I'm going to be probably doing to the end of my life, is Sergei Eisenstein. And when you look at the small number of films that Eisenstein was able to actually make, I mean, it's 7.5 or 8, depending how you look at it. It's a very, very small body of work when you consider the number of projects that he had, wanted to make, could have made, and so forth. It's tiny. And instead, what he did was to pour a huge amount of energy into his theoretical writings, his essays, and his drawings. And my argument, I've published a book of his drawings, and I've written a lot about the drawings, is that you can kind of see these as, just as much part of his creative output as the great films. I mean, you may not think they're as important, but there's so much material in the drawings, as there is in the writings, of course, that you're selling Eisenstein short if you don't take that into account. I call it the third text. If you can get access to the drawings, and increasingly they are accessible. We've done this big Thames and Hudson book, which indeed, incidentally, you see how things tie up. I said to Scorsese, if I get this book together, will you write a foreword, a preface? And he said, yep, I'll do it. Many years later, we got the
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Together, and he was in the middle of editing Silence, very, preoccupied by that, but he responded to the call, and he did deliver a really good foreword to the others because he knew that was important as well. So I'm very lucky that a lot of my interests do connect up, and they mean something to the people that I'm, in contact with.
And it's so fascinating as well that Eisenstein has this, once more, this sort of foundational role in creating the grammar of film language. He contributes to the concept of, the montage most famously, but in all aspects. I mean, I think you can focus a little bit too much sometimes on montage at the expense of, some of his compositions are amazing, and, the whole experience of watching the films.
Sure. No, that's absolutely true. Many people have got a very kind of simplistic notion of montage, but Eisenstein kept on refining his ideas about montage all the way through his career. He was still, developing what montage meant in the 1930s, long after silent cinema was over, and right through into the 1940s. And he was looking ahead. One of his last great essay, which I love rubbing people's nose in, was about the future of stereoscopic cinema. He was absolutely convinced in 1948, beginning of 1948, that 3D was the future. He'd only seen one 3D film, the first one that was made in the Soviet Union, but he just knew that that was what cinema had to embrace. And he was also very scornful about what he's described as bourgeois critics in the West who are, decrying it. Well, they're still doing it.
Sorry, go ahead.
But Eisenstein knew it was important, and he knew that thinking through 3D and the implications of 3D would actually be the making of cinema. And I think that, that's a profound, utterly forward-looking line to pursue. And I've published an essay recently about immersive experiences, which has got a very long history, going all the way back into the 18th century and earlier. People have been trying to come up with immersive media. Now we have digital immersive media, and they're still looking for, if you like, cultural respectability. They don't get it, seen as a gimmick. And as I say in my essay, Eisenstein, would have understood perfectly what the makers of digital immersive experiences are trying to do. I mean, he might not have thought they were doing it right yet, but he would have understood that urge, that impulse to harness immersive technologies and do something with them, just as he did at the end of Ivan the Terrible. He's finishing the film, and with great difficulty at the end of the war, the Soviet army has captured Agfa film stock as a trophy. They brought it back to the Soviet Union. Eisenstein sees his opportunity, grabs it, and puts a color sequence into the end of Ivan the Terrible. And there it is for us to enjoy. That was sheer opportunism for him.
The banditry involved in
exactly.
That's what the artist bandit, the artist.
Yeah, exactly. And he didn't even, the film hadn't even been released when he died. In February 48, he died, and the part 2, which has the color sequence in it, was banned. And it was not unbanned until 1956, until Khrushchev came to power. So everything that Eisenstein had done, what he'd foreseen, what he'd poured into his last work, remained unseen until very nearly our own time, until the end of the 50s.
I was thinking about what you were just saying then about immersive technologies in terms of film, and I think one of the problems that they might have is how it hasn't really got a uniform delivery system yet. You know, I go to the island at the Venice Film Festival where they have the VR, and each booth seems to be offering a different kind of experience and a different kind of, you sit down or do you stand up? Are you dancing and participating, or is it a kind of game, or you know, so or is it a documentary that you're just inside of? And I think the experience itself and the experiences are wonderful, but until they work out, are we doing this at home? Are we doing this communally? That you know, whereas with film, you go into a cinema, you sit in a seat, and you know, even if it's a 3D film or a 2D film, it's still, the delivery system is pretty much the same wherever you go. No, no,
No, I don't agree.
Okay.
Agree on two levels. One is that why should forms of immersive delivery or display, why should they all fall into one pattern? Who says? Film doesn't. There are many, many, many different kinds of film. So why should immersive formats all fall one track? But the other argument, I mean, you say we know what film is remained the same. We sink into our seat in the cinema. Oh no, we don't. I mean, a big study that I worked on for the BFI and the Film Council back in 2011, we showed that only 6% of film viewings happen in a cinema then. That was in 2011. 2%, by the way, happened in aeroplanes. We also discovered that.
Wow.
People watch film in all sorts of ways, and the ways in which they watch them, you know, have just proliferated. So the vast majority of viewings are happening in the same way that I'm talking to you now on a laptop. That's the majority method, or on a tablet, in a plane, or on a train. That's how people watch films. This fantasy that we watch films sitting in plush cinema seats, far from it. I would say less than 5% of viewings happen in cinema seats. So film has proved, I mean, you're right about one thing, film has proved very resilient in terms of adapting itself to these different modes of delivery. And perhaps the biggest one of all, by the way, is the fact that we can now pause a film. Just think about that. That was the real meaning of the video revolution. I want to pause a film, stop it, go away and do something, and come back to it. That probably was the biggest single change in the film experience in the whole history of cinema. The fact that you could stop it and come back to it. And that's just continued more and more and more and more. So I think that what we're doing now when we watch a film is very different from anything cinema shaped. And if I'm watching a 1940s film now, in any of the ways that I might be watching it, I'm performing a fundamentally different operation in many ways to what its original audiences would have done. Now,
I'm going to play the Joker and allow myself to U-turn on this completely and say, is that therefore speaks to the resilience of film, that it can be so adaptable and can be done in this way. And maybe that is the problem of the immersive experience, that you have to go and do it in one particular way in order to, you know, so the opposite of what I just said.
No. You're moving quickly on your feet. That's absolutely true. That is the problem with all sorts of gadgetry that has come along to enhance the filming experience, that it's constantly changing. I mean, I had that experience. I was doing a bit of field research on immersive media during the last London Film Festival, and I signed up to do an AR walk through the centre of London, which was a part of the expanded version of the London Film Festival. And when I got to Trafalgar Square, to the starting point, I held up my phone. It was the right type of phone, an Android, and I switched it on, and it said, "Your phone is not compatible with this program." It turned out it only works with a certain generation or model of Android phone. So I had to kind of abandon my plans, go back, contact the makers of the program, and we had a second go, and it worked. You could imagine that happening with film. And it has happened to all of us many times. You know, the bloody cassette won't play, the DVD won't play, it's the wrong region. Yeah, there are all sorts of difficulties that get in our way, which we kind of take in our stride because we know we can get around them somehow. Relatively speaking, immersive and new media formats are kind of in their infancy. and the rapid changes in technology are not helping. This is absolutely true. They're really not helping at all. We're in the grip of an industry or a set of industries that are obsessed with innovation and novelty and giving us updates, and has survived that to the point where, it has managed to cross from one format to another, and it often be enhanced in the process. But that's also an interesting experience. If you watch a super enhanced version of a 1940s film, a Powell Pressburger film or an Eisenstein film, we're not seeing it in the same way again as the audiences of the 1940s saw it. And there's nobody who can make that comparison. All we can say for sure is it's not the same. It may be profoundly not the same, but or maybe only slightly. Does this mean that there is a kind of essence of film that somehow transcends the way it's delivered? Maybe, but it's modified by the way it's delivered. And the audience that's watching A Matter of Life and Death in the latest 4K restoration is, I think, arguably having certainly a qualitatively very different experience from the audiences who saw it in 1946. And they're seeing more in it. So that allows for a greater depth of engagement.
Yeah, it reminds me of talking. I apologize because I always sort of think back to literature on some of these questions, but it's like where does Hamlet live? I mean, obviously Nelson but does he live in the written text? Does he live in any given performance? Does he live in the original? Does the original performance, which is irretrievable, have any a certain authenticity for being potentially having Shakespeare act in it? Or does it live in the films, or does it live as a sort of emergent property above and beyond all of that? It's sort of Hamlet becomes a language that these are all different iterations of. And so the same is going to be true maybe of film.
Yeah. No, it is. I think it is already the same is true, that it's the sum total of the different modes of performance or experience. And Frank Kermode, who was a great literary critic, who I got to know in the last years of his life, turned out he was really interested in film, but he'd never written about film. And I managed to tempt him to come onto a radio program that I was doing and talk about his interest in film. But Frank Kermode wrote he gave a series of lectures on the idea of the classic, which I think is absolutely foundational. I encourage people to read it. And in those lectures, he says, what do we mean by classic? We mean a text which is capable of being fundamentally reinterpreted from completely different standpoints through a period of time. So, we call, I don't know, a text like Dante's Purgatorio, or the whole sequence of Dante. That's something which has been passed down through the centuries, radically reinterpreted, has given rise to its own imitations, its own modifications, its own forms, etc. It is distinct. Well, it's separate from any of the instantiations, any of the texts which are its bearers, as it were. And for Kermode, that's the definition of a classic. A classic is something which is capable of being reinterpreted radically, differently down the years. It's true of film. If you look at what was valued about a film in the 1930s, and then look at it, if it survived in successive decades, people see quite different things in it. And that's what makes some films classics and others not.
And sometimes we look at different sort of genres which were never purposed as, I'm thinking of sort of, I don't know, Italian gialli or something like that, which were never produced with the idea of this will survive and be regarded as a classic of cinema. And yet they have achieved that because we now look at that genre in a totally different light to the way it was perceived and conceived at the time of its production.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. The even more classic example would be the Western.
Right.
The idea of putting Westerns on a pedestal and talking about classic Westerns and great filmmakers who devoted their chunk of their career to making Westerns, that is a very modern idea, really. It's an idea that I would say comes from the 1960s at the earliest and developed through the 70s and through the 80s. But it certainly wasn't the case in the 1930s. And, when John Ford famously turned up at a meeting in Hollywood and said, "I'm John Ford. I make westerns." He wasn't boasting, as it were. On the contrary, he was establishing the fact that he made actually one of the lowest and most despised genres, something that had been just the bread and butter of cinema from the previous 20, 30 years. So that, yeah, we can canonize. And I think this is this process of canonization of creating canons of excellence, which is also something I've written about, is really interesting, because often you get people, especially when it comes to making up lists, who say, "I don't believe in lists. I don't believe in canons." To which I say, it doesn't matter whether you believe in canons. They exist. They exist whether or not you believe in them, because they're what drives the scale of values. They're what drives what gets revered, valued, awarded, restored. If a film or a filmmaker isn't in a canon, as it were, their film doesn't get restored, and nobody writes about it. So canons are a very powerful kind of underpinning reality, I think, and they change. I mean, they definitely change. That's what's so interesting about I've been involved with the Sight and Sound, 10-yearly poll for the last, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. I was involved in helping to run it at various stages when I worked at the BFI, and for the most recent one, I actually was invited to help expand the base of people who contribute to it.
Including me. Fools that you are! You let me in!
Yeah, my lips are sealed about who I brought on board, but look what happened. Look what happened.
Riff raff.
Chantal came out on top. And then that took a lot of people by surprise. That's partly a result, of course, of polling a wider range of people. Not just more people, but a wider range of types of people in different places. But the evolution of canons and how things become canonical and indeed stop being canonical. That's interesting too.
No, the Western to some degree.
I think you're right. I think what the experience of Westerns in the last, let's say 20 years or so, roughly, has been of constant surprise when a new star Western appears. People say, "Gosh, isn't it amazing? People can still make, something different and unusual and etc." As if that hadn't been going on through the entire history of the Western, which of course it has been, and that is pretty intriguing. I mean, once upon a time, say, Dances with Wolves was treated with real reverence, even, or respect, certainly. Now it's become a sort of whipping boy in many ways, and yeah, those standout art Westerns that we've seen over the last, well, it's a longer period, after the last 30 or 40 years or so, are films that have been made with a deep consciousness on the part of those making that they're making them against the backdrop of decades of forgotten Westerns. So they're kind of trying to climb up the pile and say, "Look, you can still do things with the materials of this old genre." That's what Scorsese has done with his having finally made his Western.
With Killers of the Flower Moon.
Killers, exactly. Yeah, he didn't like it being described as his Western, but of course it is, and it conforms in many ways to the requirement for a modern Western, which is to make it new and to colonize some area of the historical Western material which hasn't been really dealt with before. There's a whole there's a sort of one of the threads you can trace back through the history of the Western is when somebody has brought, the first telegraph into the Western, the first this, the first that, etc., the first fridge, truck that's carrying fridges, and things like that. All of those, there's a moment where you can use the novelty of introducing new elements, new historical elements, usually into the Western, which sort of reanimates the genre and shows that it's at bottom, it's still dealing with the same dramatic essentials, but it can be remediated, let's say.
I was recently I was in Cannes and watched Horizon, which is the new Kevin Costner Western. Just mentioned Dances with Wolves, and I was really surprised because it's a very traditional, very possibly quite conservative Western. Certainly not particularly revisionist or radical, but it is the first chapter of a apparently very long work. And at the end of the Western, for me, it had done so many things very well that I was very happy with it. I thought this is a great entry into the genre. And I, as you do at Cannes, I was applauding at the end of the screening and quickly realized I was the only person in the room applauding. And around me, people were kind of scoffing and groaning. And I was, oh, am I so... I appear to be not in the middle of the critical, whatever this is, the critical moment, you know.
That's something which can happen to you in Cannes. I went to Cannes for decades when I worked for the BFI. I think I did about 35 Cannes film festivals, which is probably more than a human being should do. But I remember during one of them, there was a Chantal Akerman film showing. I was then and am now very, very enthusiastic about Chantal Akerman. And this was Le Rendezvous d'Anna. And people, as we were all fighting to get in, could we get into this packed out screening? It was on the Rue d'Antibes, one of the old suite of cinemas that used to be there. And I thought it was terrific. I think I was seeing on the front. And come the end of the film, I looked around. It was an empty cinema.
Yeah, everybody had left.
Audience that had been fighting to get in only less than 2 hours earlier had melted away. And that when you really realize just how unfashionable a filmmaker can become in their own lifetime.
Absolutely.
Hey,
I mean,
there's always another turn of the wheel. And, you know, since Chantal sadly died, her star has certainly risen. And in fact, there's a chapter in a new book I've just edited called Spaces, where we have a wonderful piece by a French scholar who really knows Akerman's work inside out. And the great thing about this chapter, Sarah Lepesci, is that she actually takes on board all of Akerman's installations and video work, as well as the films. So it's a very, very kind of wide-ranging piece which sees Akerman's work as a whole in all its different forms, because it's not just the films, it's also all the other work that she did around the films, deconstructing, in fact, installations in some cases.
Yes, and I think her, there's that form of cinema which sometimes you watch, and I'm particularly thinking of slow cinema, which sometimes you think of, oh, is this the appropriate sort of venue for it? Would I sit and watch this more in an art gallery than I am? And then you go to an art gallery and you find the same film, and the same filmmaker is actually doing installations and is doing exactly that. So the criticism doesn't really hold, because you can go there or you can go here.
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge that's facing a lot of makers. I mean, Isaac Julian, who's somebody whose work I'm very interested in and have followed right, from its beginnings. Isaac has done one of his recent pieces, Lessons of the Hour, which is a piece about the great American abolitionist who came to Britain and gave a lecture in the mid-19th century. One version of that, which I saw in his retrospective at Tate Britain, was on 7 or 8 or more screens. So it's a completely different experience as you scan across the screens, tracking the movement of the same image in some cases, or things you can't see, because of peripheral vision. He's now done a single screen version of it, which was in the recent, maybe it's the current show at the Royal Academy. No, it's the recent one of Entangled Pasts. So he's turned that multi-screen work into a single screen. It's still the same footage, but reconfigured in a different way. And I think that's an option which almost all filmmakers have now. They can remake the same work as a different experience if they choose to. Scorsese is an example of somebody who doesn't choose to. Scorsese is adamant, I think, still about that he doesn't want there to be different versions of any of his films. He's not interested in director's cuts or anything like that. He wants the film that he signs off on is the film. That's it. But I think that's maybe an unfashionable, or at least maybe it's a minority attitude. I think there are many filmmakers clearly who have enjoyed the experience of revisiting their work and remaking it in a different format. And I think we'll probably see more of that in the future. I mean, Ackerman in that sense was a pioneer. She took her early 16 millimeter work and reconfigured it in experiential forms, which I have to say were wonderful. Those that I managed to see.
Yeah, I always think of Ridley Scott in this as a filmmaker who's constantly, and he's almost being told, we'll release this as the thing, and we'll, you don't worry, you've got a director's cut coming up. But I always think that that often means that the theatrical cut is a little bit too short and the director's cut is a little bit too long. So it's just like, if he was told he has one and that's that, then it might, he might make the right compromises and have it, if such a thing is possible.
Ridley is the kind of person who would put up with being told that. I think he's a man used to getting his own way, but also very flexible in other ways, very pragmatic. I remember some people who worked on what is probably one of his biggest hits, Gladiator, when the film came out, and they said to me, well, what did you think of it? I told them what I thought. They said, that's interesting. That was not the film you saw in the cinema, not the film that we signed off on. It went through a radical revision after the first test screenings. And I don't know whether that's fully documented or not, but they were very, very clear that the film had been more than tweaked to produce the version that we know. And I think, that was obviously done fully with the knowledge of Scott. I don't think it's much talked about, but there it is.
What was the major change that they had made?
Well, what they told me was that basically the whole treatment of the Joachim Phoenix character of the emperor, there was a major readjustment of attitudes towards him, and it was much less clear cut where your sympathies were going to lie in the original cut of the film.
Okay.
So that I mean, I don't have any more detail, but that was people who'd worked on it who felt quite strongly that it had been tweaked. Perhaps you could say to make it the success that it became.
It's so interesting when you go into the making of films, and when you, as a film scholar, you have obviously. I mean, this is another way maybe of asking that question, and then I know we're short on time, so I'll wrap up soon after. But when you know the sausage factory inside out, and yet you still, from your enthusiasm, you still have that appreciation of film. Do you? I mean, I personally feel that it kind of enhances my enjoyment of the knowing everything around it. How do you feel about that? Do you still eat those? Do you still eat the sausage? I guess I'm asking.
I still eat the sausage. Yeah, I think the pressure on a filmmaker to finalize the film is an important one. I mean, it's just the same as sending the manuscript off when you're trying to publish a book. For better or for worse, you've done that. You may have options to do a different version. And it's funny you mentioned that. Just in my own case, that I mentioned that I've been writing about immersive media recently. And in fact, one piece that I've done, this essay, now exists in 3 different forms. One of them's online, one of them's printed in a book, and another one is floating around somewhere else. And I like that opportunity to play it differently for different contexts. I very much like that. But yeah, when we've entered a stage where the filmmaker can produce a variant version of the work, can rethink it, we've moved into a different era, haven't we? Because film was not like that. Film was, for better or worse, the film that went out, and that was it. And so classic cinema, which I believe is in the past, we are now living in a post-cinema world. We still have film production, lots of it, like is on display in all the festivals, but it's not cinema clearly as it was during the period when essentially it was being made for theatrical exhibition and to some extent for TV transmission. That has all changed. And so while we have many of the same forms and formats, they're not working in the same way. And what is happening at the moment is that the form of the multi-part streamed series, which is obviously the major dramatic form of today, it's what most people watch most of the time, is not being given the same kind of kudos as the single feature film. That's interesting. Why not? But it isn't, or not yet. Maybe it never will be. But so we have curiously come full circle round to the fact that when Dickens had a new novel in mind, he first of all writes it in installments, he publishes it in installments, and then he puts it together in a book. We've come full circle. That's possible.
I love the way as well Dickens was often writing the beginning installment of his next novel as he was writing the last two installments of. So it's, if you read his books, they're always brilliant at the beginning because he's excited, and they often have quite weak endings because he's obviously running out of steam and he's already actually, I'll write the Martin Chuzzlewit in the morning and then I'll write the next one in the afternoon.
Absolutely.
And there's a new Brian Eno documentary as well where they're actually shuffling the scenes for every single screening. And so how can we talk about that meaningfully as it's like as critics, we're going to have to move with the times.
Absolutely. Moving with the times is what it's all about. Remediation. It's the name of the game.
Excellent, Ian. Just a very quick last question, which is, have you got a recommended film book you could give our listeners so they can explore further?
Other than my own?
All of your own come highly recommended by this podcast. I don't think there's anybody listening to this podcast who is not at the moment ordering a bunch of your books.
Oh, I'm pretty sure there are. Well, I mean, what do I think are the really interesting and useful books? I mean, I go back to André Bazin. But I go back to Bazin with some irritation because the version of Bazin that we've got in English, this rather paltry edition put out by the University of California Press, terrible. The translations are bad and the selection is pretty erratic. And if you do go back to the big Bazin collection, which exists in French, you find he wrote about so much more. I mean, Bazin was the 3D enthusiast. You would never guess that from stuff that you read in the English edition. He was enthusiastic about novelty and innovation of all kinds. So that I think is really interesting. I think that Bazin is still tremendously useful. I think the best modern writer who sadly left us quite recently, a matter of months ago, is David Bordwell. And I think that David's work, I always feel that if you're going to put a book in the hands of somebody who is unconvinced about the significance of cinema, it would generally be a book by David, because I think that David kind of played it straight and really tried to take cinema seriously without getting, pompous about it. And it was great knowing him and seeing his work emerge, and knowing. I did a book recently about the Russian movement that was happening at the same time as Eisenstein, the factory of the eccentric actor, FX. And I wrote to David. It turned out only a few months before his death, mentioned that I was doing this, and he said, we really need a book about FX. Of course, I agree with him, but How wonderful that he kept that enthusiasm, because he knew his way around the history of early Soviet cinema as so much else. And he was always ready to, encourage you to go further and look at areas that are perhaps not sufficiently highly regarded.
Excellent. That was a wonderful tribute as well. To a great writer. Thank you so much, Ian, for taking your time to speak with me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
Selling a little or a lot? Shopify helps you do your thing however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify is there to help you grow. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Get a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/work. Shopify.com/work.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.